In 1980, the Sinn Féin Women's Department was born. The creation of the department came at a critical juncture in both the development of Republican feminism in Northern Ireland and the re-emergence and rebranding of Sinn Féin, largely considered to be the political wing of the Irish Republican Army, or the IRA. In many ways, the timing was just right for Republican women to engage with electoral politics and public policy in Northern Ireland through the department. In this first image, you can see that in the early 1980s, female activists embraced the intersectionality of women's issues and the national liberation struggle. This intersectionality is a key theme of my paper today. Iconography that combined both women's struggles and the armed struggle were used early in the 1980s, starting with the Armagh Dirty protests and the activism that surrounded it. The prison protest was an IRA response to the gender-based violence found within the confines of the jail. The Armagh Dirty protests reinvigorated Republican women who had previously organized around Republican men's issues, such as their ongoing protest against criminalization. Now these female activists could engage with work that had an explicitly gendered component. After organizing rallies and distributing print media surrounding the Armagh women in grassroots, intersectional, anti-colonial feminist organizations such as Women Against Imperialism wanted a more unified and powerful political entity to work under. Republican women, however, felt exiled from the mainstream middle class and often explicitly anti-nationalist feminist movements found in both the North and Republic of Ireland. As one letter to Sinn Féin newspaper stated, the existing women's movements in this country offers no solutions. They are dominated by the middle class intellectuals and are too often British oriented. So there's a need for a true movement, and the lead must come from the Revolutionary Party of Sinn Féin. The answer to that call for an institutional entity that specifically dealt with the needs of Republican women came in the form of the Women's Department. At the 1980 party conference, the Young Department presented a policy document, Women in the New Ireland. This was the first Irish political document on women's issues. The policies tackled issues ranging from state-subsidized childcare, sexism in education, to the most controversial topics in Irish society, LGBTQ rights, divorce, abortion. The covers for the various updated iterations of this document utilize the female feminist Venus symbol, a motif we will examine throughout the paper. Prior to 1981, however, Sinn Féin possessed little political or electoral power, so Women in the New Ireland consisted mostly of a hopeful set of values for Sinn Féin. There was little potential for structural change. The 1981 hunger strikes, elections, and party conference changed that. Since 1978, when Gerry Adams rose to prominence as the vice president of Sinn Féin, the organization debated a tactical entrance into electoral politics. Adams criticized, quote, the failure to develop revolutionary politics and to build a strong political alternative. The prison protests of the 1970s and the hunger strikes of the early 1980s, particularly the famous one in 1981, presented the opportunity for Sinn Féin and other Republicans to become more involved in the political process. The election of hunger striker Bobby Sands to Westminster not only brought democratic political legitimacy to Sinn Féin via the over 30,000 votes in favor of Sands, but also over the course of the campaign, Sinn Féin realized the benefit and strength in coalition-based organizing, which increased their political base to include those who were in trade unions and gay liberation groups, and of course, feminist groups like Women Against Imperialism. The election also proved the power of the young voter to Sinn Féin. 14% of people who voted for Bobby Sands in 1981 had never voted before. In the June 1981 Dáil elections, more prisoners were run, including feminist Mairead Farrell. All things considered, Sinn Féin did exceptionally well. They pulled votes primarily from Fianna Fáil, the alleged nationalist party of the South, signaling that young, more socially, politically, and economically marginalized people were ready for an increasingly radical, new, and modern Ireland. With increasing political legitimacy, the party realized they needed to develop a political platform that went beyond Brits out. If Sinn Féin took on women's issues, they had the potential to bring in female voters and supporters, and not even those with the Republican persuasions necessarily. Women, especially in Sinn Féin, also proved to be some of the best electoral organizers. The basis of Sinn Féin's political strategy was created by a young feminist law student, Sheena Campbell. Aside from potential electoral and organizational gains that the party had from embracing women's issues, this acceptance of feminism was ideologically consistent with ideas of republicanism, self-determination, freedom, and liberation. The infrastructure of the department had been in place since 1980, so when the political door opened in 1981, the time was just right. Neil Gilmartin has specifically examined the disintegration of the women's department, building on other scholarship surrounding women's transition from anti-imperial agent to member of a post-colonial state. Work like Cynthia Cockburn's find that once these anti-colonial agents gain power, as in the case with Sinn Féin in the peace process, the feminist rhetoric found within these movements prior are weakened. This usually results in a return of the status quo of gender inequality. It would be wrong, however, to say that the Sinn Féin Women's Department had no effect on the party, because that is simply not true. Because of the activism found in the Women's Department, Sinn Féin did and continues to have some of the most progressive policies on abortion, LGBTQ issues, among other welfare needs, even if sometimes these agendas are tied to politically pragmatic efforts. The reality is, however, the time preceding, during, and following the peace process saw women's issues fall to the back burner in favor of focusing on obtaining peace and/or power. I believe it is not my place to pass judgment on whether that was a politically necessary step. I think many of the women in the department felt the shared ambivalence about recognizing the importance of the peace process and yet seeing an eclipse women's work. Women recognized both the urgency and fragility of the moment preceding the Good Friday Agreement. Simultaneously, there was a sense of loss of the political momentum of women's rights activism in the party, and more generally, the Republican movement. Gilmartin's work concludes that due to the demands of the peace process, the women's department simply faded away. There was no definitive and climactic end to the department. I believe that we can see this shift and gradual dissolution happen by examining the material culture of the women's department, at first highlighting feminist iconography as to identify with more militant feminism, slowly becoming less visually inclined to use the iconographic vocabulary of intersectionality, ultimately fronting the peace process and the inclusion of Sinn Féin instead. I open with this Sinn Féin Women's Department poster because I believe it does a good job in utilizing visual cues that allude to nationalism, Irish republicanism, and feminism. First, we see that women are raising the flag. Not only does this center the strength and power of women by giving them the role of raising the flag, but in utilizing the iconic imagery of the act of raising the flag, famously seen here or in photos like Ground Zero Spirit. These types of photos generally suggest unity, strength, and hard-won progress. The flag, of course, serves as an emblem of patriotism and quite literally shows people rallying around a or the flag. All of these attributes were ideals the women's department were trying to relay. Hard-won progress for women in the party, the strength and resiliency of the Republican movement, especially its women. Obviously, there are going to be different implications in using this visual language for a state entity opposed to a non-state or even terrorist faction. But in many ways, the Republican movement of the 1980s and 1990s felt they were picking up where James Connolly left off as Irish patriots. Speaking of James Connolly, you can see a more modern version of stars from the starry plough present in the top right of the poster. The starry plough originally comes from the flag of James Connolly's Irish Citizen Army. Thus, Sinn Féin's use of it showcases their commitment and alignment to socialism and a free Ireland, despite how those two visions may actually differ between the two entities. As we can see here, both the use of the raising of the flag and the starry plough can be found in these details from other prints of the women's department. The raising of the Venus flag, which we will talk about more in just a moment, was on their letterhead. Additionally, the starry plough crops up again on this flyer, once again intermeshed with the Venus symbol. Both of these symbols not only connected the women's department to an iconographic tradition of Irish republicanism, but also the emotive and patriotic or nationalistic pathos that accompanies these photos of the triumphant raising of the flag. The most frequent motif to be found in the material culture of the Sinn Féin's women's department is the Venus symbol, often used as a symbol for females and thus feminism. Here, of course, we see it imprinted on the Irish tricolour, a statement of Irish womanhood to be sure. The motif, while used frequently for Sinn Féin to bridge the national and gender struggle, also, of course, places Sinn Féin within a visual vocabulary of the second wave feminist movement, who use this astrological and astronomical symbol to represent womanhood. While the use of the Venus symbol remained, the context in which the women's department used it changed over time. Earlier in the department's history, you would see the symbol evoked in more radical or militant ways. 3 of these images specifically reference the armed struggle with a fist holding a gun. Appropriating the iconography of other movements in the 1960s and 70s, such as the Black Power movement, the fist was adopted and incorporated into the Venus symbol. We can see that being used most clearly in the last image, but also the first 2, where a fist is holding a gun. Additionally, 2 of these works showcase the department's and, more generally, the Republican movement's attempt to form international solidarity with women in other anti-colonial revolutionary struggles. The Sinn Féin Women's Department also utilized the Venus in their imagery and activism surrounding abortion. Both images come from Sinn Féin in 1992, the year of the X case. In 1992, a 14-year-old girl, X, became pregnant after being raped. She wanted to go to England to receive an abortion. The Irish state, however, placed a travel injunction on the child, thus prohibiting her from obtaining the procedure abroad. One of the most active sections of Sinn Féin on matters relating to abortion, especially during the 1992 X case, was the Derry City Town Council. Many feminist Sinn Féin members sat on the Derry City Council, including Daisy Mules, Martha McClelland, and Mary Nellis. The council issued numerous statements concerning the removal of the Eighth Amendment, the one in the Irish Constitution that previously prohibited abortion. The council also felt so strongly about the X case that in the Sinn Féin Christmas stamp they issued that year, they depicted Ireland with a Venus symbol over it. The image was captioned Saoirse, or freedom. There's a dual message here. First, free women and liberate them from the oppressive nature of Irish abortion laws that we see in the X case. But also, as very common to the political ideology of Sinn Féin, there's no border on this map. They are trying to represent free Ireland. Additionally, the second image refers to their policy document entitled Freedom Not for Irish Women, where Sinn Féin addressed a variety of concerns surrounding the Eighth Amendment in the 1992 abortion referendum. This included issues the right to travel for an abortion, the right to receive abortion information in Ireland, and the distinction between life and health that is involved in the rationale for getting an abortion. Lastly, in the mid to late 1990s, the Venus symbol remained, but the content had dramatically changed. No longer is the Women's Department praising sisters abroad for their commitment to the armed struggle, or even alluding to any militaristic iconography. The message is clear: include Sinn Féin in the peace talks. While women in Sinn Féin were involved in the peace process, more so than other delegates, barring Northern Ireland's Women's Coalition, it is undeniable that the notable names, signatories, and victors of the peace were men like Gerry Adams and Martin McGuinness, who saw a notable rise in political power following the agreement. Either way, we see the message shifting to the needs of the party more generally over those of the Women's Department more specifically. Additionally, images that include women, such as the one on the left, are far more subtle than before. The Ireland is still united, and so is the image of the women here, but the message has shifted. A woman's place is in the struggle for freedom, justice, and peace. We can also see a shift in the use of International Women's Day by the department. March 8th, International Women's Day, had historically been used to organize around causes such as female prisoners or abortion rights. Now they became an opportunity to protest the exclusion of Sinn Féin from the peace talks. Both images convey a moment that involves the shift from militancy to respectability, from armed campaigns to the liberal democratic arena. Ultimately, this was the completion of a goal Sinn Féin had been seeking since 1981. It could be argued that this iconographic and political shift simply reflected the needs and priorities of the department. Who are we to criticize those assessed needs as being patriarchal? It is difficult to judge if peace was a more worthy cause in Northern Ireland than women's liberation, but it didn't necessarily have to be either or. The Women's Department probably could have simultaneously been maintained on the eve of the Good Friday Agreement. Despite the ultimate fizzling out of the department, it is undeniable they left their mark on Sinn Féin. That is easily seen through Sinn Féin's acceptance of abortion, LGBTQ issues, and other progressive policies years before other parties did. While the Sinn Féin Women's Department has been lost to history, their legacy and print culture remain an important documentation of the intersectionality of feminism and republicanism, and ultimately the downfall of women's sectors of the Republican movement in the years preceding the Good Friday Agreement. Thank you.